Hi listeners, Jason here. We're on the countdown to PHSCon 2025, where we bring some of the leading experts on the topic of psychosocial safety to Sydney for 2 full days on the 19th and 20th of June. With so many great speakers, industry case studies and networking opportunities for the 500 people in attendance, it is the psychosocial safety community event of the year. Highlights will surely include live podcast recordings with Adam Grant and Professor Rob Reiner, international insights from Mary Ann Bainton, Dr. I. David Daniels, Peter Kelly from Canada, the US and UK respectively, as well as entertainment from Jimmy Reese OAM. That's right, we've even got Jimmy Giggle. Early bird pricing is available for a limited time, so get in quick to secure discounted tickets for the conference, pre-conference masterclasses and the VIP dinner. Now, on to this episode.
From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. I'm Kim MacDonald, and I'm one of 3 hosts now. We have 3 hosts for the Canadian version of Psych Health and Safety. And I'm excited today to welcome my guest, Steven Mah. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Steven, and then I'm going to ask him to share a little bit about himself too. So Steven is a psych health and safety practitioner who works at WorkSafe BC as an industry and program specialist. He has a master's. He has a whole list of qualifications, and he has a master's in science, and he's also a Canadian registered safety professional. And I love that background, Stephen, of science and the safety world. So I'm excited for our conversation. So if I invite you to share a little bit about yourself and let our listeners know maybe how you came to this work and a little bit about your background.
Sure. Thanks, Kim, for having me. Really looking forward to the conversation. And hi to everybody listening. So how did I get into this? Truthfully, a little bit like I fell into it in many ways, but I couldn't feel more like it aligned with sort of who I am and what kind of my passions are. So I did start in what we call traditional or physical health and safety. That's what I went to post-secondary for. Did that for probably about 12 years. But what was always interesting about health and safety is, as you grow up and people ask you, what do you want to do for a living? Being a health and safety person was definitely not on my sort of bingo card or list of professions I thought I would get into. And in full disclosure, I didn't actually know what a person did in health and safety. I didn't realize that was a job. So when I did sort of fall into that profession, I was even more surprised as to what it actually was that I was doing when I, sort of graduated and started working. And what I found is that when I was working, I was dealing with people pretty much 100% of the time, which sort of spurred my first love, which was in psychology, which is what I started university in actually. And that kind of prompted me to look at that intersection between, physical health and safety and the psychology of it. And then this concept of psychological health and safety started to really gain some attention. And that's what prompted me to go back to grad school, actually, to really focus in on this area. And as I started to learn more about it, I started to realize so much of this is interconnected. And there's such huge opportunities, certainly individually or professionally, but also for organizations as they start to sort of buy into this concept and recognize the importance of looking at workers holistically in their totality as individuals and as human beings. And that's, to me, where a lot of this kind of intersects. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into it. When I went back to grad school, I started looking more at where could I get a stronger background in mental health in particular, and that prompted me to go and become a registered counselor and learn about psych health and safety training through places like University of Fredericton, CMHA, so on and so forth. And yeah, that's sort of how I collected my journey.
That's great. It's a wonderful, it is definitely a wonderful growing field as practitioners. And as I'm in it more and more over the years, experiencing and meeting more people who have come into the practice and profession from different sort of different windows, different doors, but it is always that intersection of science, psychology, and the health and safety, and recognition that this work, the ultimate outcome, is to influence mental health and well-being at work. But the other piece that we're going to talk about, which is, and any of our listeners who are familiar with the Canadian National Standard and the 13 factors, or the ISO standard for psych health and safety, workplace culture from a psychosocial factor is, I'm so excited to be talking to you about this because I have a special bias toward and positivity towards action in culture. And not to set any factor apart from the others, but if I was to put them in a hierarchy, let's say, there may be that I would have a hierarchy and culture would be very much at the top. And we can talk a little bit about that, and we can debate that even. But it's that some of these other factors are really embedded in that work, like when you are trying to be intentional about culture. So we're going to talk about workplace culture. So from your perspective, how would you define it? How would you define workplace culture?
Absolutely, and I think you would find a partner in the ranking system on this side here. But when I think about culture and workplace culture, I'm thinking about the collective values or beliefs, behaviors, kind of the underlying assumptions that really shape how employees interact and accomplish the work. So it's kind of like the unwritten rules of an organization in lots of ways, because that's kind of how I view culture as it's this sort of collection of values and beliefs that really shape how people interact and how the work gets done. And in large organizations, sometimes culture is pre-baked in or predefined, and that can also lead to some interesting situations when you're trying to modify or adapt say culture. So I'm really excited to get into this with Kim and talk a bit about how do you shape that, how do you make adaptations to culture, how do you establish a culture net new, lots of those sorts of things. But yeah, that's how I look at it, as sort of a collection of values and beliefs and kind of that underwritten uh, understanding of how things get done.
We see the iceberg model used for culture to help explain and describe culture. Maybe you could share a little bit, Stephen, your sort of describe it for our listeners and how it might help anyone who's trying to, explore this culture that seems sometimes really difficult to understand, and then to get your head around what you're supposed to be seeing and what you might see, and then how you can actually take that action that might actually influence it. So I think the culture, kind of the culture inside that iceberg, might be a nice place to share a little bit about.
I love that. So for those that aren't familiar, the iceberg, which in physical safety has a nice representation, I think it's just a great graphic. But when we talk about culture, you're talking about generally with an iceberg, you have the tip that's showing at the very top, so the part that's visible to everybody. And when we start talking about culture, that could be something like the representation, the employee benefits that are readily available, maybe even the branding of the company. But what's important with an iceberg is you got to remember that there's a significant shape or size or piece of it that's hidden beneath the surface that you're not able to see until either you get super close to it or you get in the water, so to speak. And under there is where you're going to see things that I would say have more significant impacts on your day to day as an employee. Is your leadership styles. Do they have a level of transparency built in? What's the actual values of the organization? Not just the spoken values, but the demonstrated values that you would sort of see day to day. I also put safety and security in my mind as the big part of the underneath the iceberg, and those are the things that are part of that culture iceberg that you may not be able to sort of grasp firsthand or first glance, I should say. Uh, Kim, I don't know if you have anything else that you'd add to that list.
No, that's a really good description. I might add that when I think about culture, and the iceberg's a good model for that, we think about um, the visual part, and the one that is feels as if it's part of the ether. It's just the way we do things here. And you had mentioned about the unspoken ways of doing things. And I think every listener who's been an employee this will resonate with them, which is how you learn about how to be inside an organization. Um, Sometimes it's written in strategy and values, and it's also either intentionally or unintentionally almost mentored. And you learn how things work, how to get things done, all of those things. And I'm speaking about not standard operating practices that are articulated or a process that's documented. It's other ways of working, and all of that, like all the sand and the big rocks inside the organization, and um, it is largely invisible until you start paying attention and noticing, and even documenting. When we do this, this is actually influencing the way we are here and our culture, and it's influencing our decisions. So there is a lot of making the invisible visible so that you can work with it and make that shift. And that is strategic work, and it's not easy. And I think that's why it's sometimes a little difficult for people to, come together when they want to come together to influence culture for in a positive way or to make a shift. How do they get their hands on things that don't feel concrete? Um, and that model in like a systems level with the structures as well as the relationships, those kinds of things are, they are challenging for people to think about.
So I thought that was a great point that you were talking about, Kim, and I actually had a sort of debate recently talking about the importance of policy, talking about, what is the value of having these written policies. When we start talking about culture, I think it's important to have documentation, mission or vision statements and certainly stated values and all of those things. But sometimes having it written and what is the actuality of what's really happening on the floor level, there's that disengagement or there's that disconnect. And that's where your comment about the importance of that training and the mentorship and that onboarding process, because that's where you're going to get that sort of reinforcement of what the actual culture is and what the actual expectations. And so when I think about the policy, one of the things we were talking about is, when we're talking about the stated policy, we're really talking about the stated values. And when you start talking about stated values of an organization, when you're new to an organization, how do you actually know that the value is what is written or what is sort of being told to you? It's what you see, what you observe, what you feel, those tangible aspects of it. So we talked about the importance of the consistency of what is being stated to what is being experienced. It's going to be so important, and subsequently the accountability when it's not being sort of met. And those are sort of these other factors that we start to talk about and start to look at. Um, so at any rate, as you were talking, that's all I was thinking about is, oh, I just had this conversation where we talked about the importance of sort of walking the walk as opposed to just talking the talk. And in many cases, organizations talk the talk in writing, just in these high level overarching documents, like policies.
The positive sort of opportunity for anyone who wants to shift um, culture is to look at some of those, all the factors that are, whether it's in the iceberg or they can gather together, as you say, some of those, the policy conversation, and have a look at policy through the lens of culture. And maybe that's a great place to shift into, another, because it seems a little difficult to get, not to understand how culture is influencing us in the workplace, but more to why to change it and how to change it. But before that, why we would even consider it. So maybe just talk a little bit about, from your perspective, what the benefits are in terms or why would someone want to take a look at their culture and what are the implications of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So from my perspective, culture really impacts employee engagement. I think it has a direct impact on performance. And one of the big issues that I consistently talk about when we talk about employers and the issues that they're facing today, obviously mental health at the workplace is number one in my opinion. I'm a little biased there, but almost universally when we talk about top three, recruitment and retention shows up as a big sort of issue that employers are struggling with. Trying to find and then retain top talent is very difficult in this current work climate. And when I start thinking about work culture and I start thinking about the numerous generations in the workforce right now, four of them currently, four distinct ones, uh, the company culture has become a selling feature for how to retain or even attract those top workers at this stage. They're looking at work as more of a part of who they are, an extension of who they are, and that's what the research is saying. Versus, I come to work, I do my 8:30 to 4:30 or my 9 to 5, and then I go home and I have my quote unquote real life. Now it's not seen that way. We're recognizing that we spend a third of our lives working. We spend arguably more time with our coworkers than we might with our closest friends and family. And so, that benefit now of looking at what is our company culture, what is, the inherent values, what is our driving sort of ROI factors or added benefits to joining this organization. And I've worked for some amazing organizations that had such wonderful company cultures that encouraged, social relationships and personal connections, and it made it much more of a place you want to go to every day and continue to stay at. And I think that does make a difference now. And it is a reason I think more larger organizations and smaller organizations are prioritizing not just creating this culture, but understanding what their culture actually is. And one of those sorts of things is you have to know where you stand before you can make any changes. So that's sort of my shout out to the importance of actually doing sort of that zero set or baselining to determine, where are we in our culture sort of landscape or journey, and what is it that our culture is projecting out to those potential new hires, and where can we maybe make some changes or really highlight what something we're doing extremely well. And a lot of companies have wonderful aspects that are tied to culture that they may not even realize employees really value. I can think of a couple right off the top of my head. There's some employers that really embrace this work remote or work from home process, and then there's others that have not, and there's a lot of employers that have structured increased autonomy into the work that's being done. And I know that's a huge factor, and we can talk about Hertzberg and motivational theory, but that's absolutely one of those ones that rings true then and certainly now. So I think that's part of the reason I view culture as so important is to help get the right people in the right spots and then help keep them there. Keep that level of engagement. It does, generally speaking, result in increased performance. And if there's that alignment between, personal values to company values, you've got this wonderful recipe for success.
Do you need more psych health and safety in your life? Then head over to the FlourishDX Academy for several free on-demand e-learning courses. If you're an internal professional, follow FlourishDX on Eventbrite to register for any of our free fortnightly interactive webinars. Our flagship professional practice program is also exclusively available for internal professionals. The 12-week course blends theory, applied practice, and interaction with other professionals through live lectures and a monthly community of practice session. Find out more about all these learning opportunities or inquire about a bespoke in-house training at the FlourishDX Academy. www.45003.org. Now back to this episode.
If you think about you mentioned engagement, so the performance and the engagement, how maybe you can give me an example of how or what kinds of decisions that an organization can make that they perhaps are already making, but they're not understanding that those actually are influencing the culture, and maybe they're influencing the engagement piece or they're influencing the employee performance component.
Yeah, for sure. So, I sort of reference Hertzberg, and I love the way that that it's been broken down. We've got these motivational factors. One of the ones that I think, and this is just speaking from my own experience, is the importance of social connection and relationships. And I think there's ways organizations can encourage that type of development at workplaces. I know for my current workplace, as an example, there is this emphasis on daily connection. Even if you are working remote, having these sort of check-in meetings where you are able to have discussions, obviously work-based, but also building in some time for that that non-work conversation that helps forge those relationships and helps really strengthen them. And from my perspective, that's something that can be extremely beneficial and have long-term value, but not every organization will see that as, adding to the ROI, and that does take time and technically resources away. If it's, and I'm not saying that you do these sorts of meetings where you spend an hour or more. I'm talking about adding, a couple minutes to each sort of conversation to focus on that humanization aspect of it. To me, that's a huge one. I also am a big believer in recognition. I think it's important that you recognize some of the achievements that our coworkers, that our employees are contributing, and it doesn't necessarily mean a recognition of, you were supposed to produce, 200 of these, or install, 600 feet of flooring today, and you did 800. It doesn't always have to be production based. It can also be for small things, interpersonal related, taking a leadership approach, or leading the meeting, or making a great suggestion. I think sometimes we're conditioned to expect that recognition has to be to some significant achievement, and I think sometimes we can appreciate the little things. Um, and I think those recognitions, those shout outs demonstrate something in my mind to the workers, that people are paying attention, that the effort, that extra effort that you might be putting in is going noticed. I think those are two pretty simple and easy to build in examples, in my opinion.
That's it also jumps really quickly and easily when you think of recognition. So from the psychosocial factors, the 13 factors, recognition and reward. And I always put them right up against respect because it's they are separate psychosocial factors in the standard, respect and civility. I've actually added in our work dignity as part of civility, dignity and respect from a whole human centered perspective. I'm sure that the National Standard Commission will be calling me to get me to explain it a little more. Um, I can't wait, Stephen, for that. However, it's so fundamental to respect, like, from my perspective, the dignity, and that just is such a beautiful, like, understanding of two people coming together in a workplace to get some work done. Um, but that recognition can be viewed as another form of respect. So it's sort of, it shows up, everybody has a different view of what does respect look and feel like, and how can I demonstrate that as an attribute of our culture, that it's a respectful culture. Uh, but I think that that recognition is a way to do that. It can be viewed as and you can ask, it's always good to ask, how do you want to be recognized? How do you want to, so that actually underscores the point you made earlier, which is about autonomy and self-determination, that, humans understand what they need to flourish, and, supervisors becoming more and more comfortable asking the team, what do you need from me to be successful in your work? That's another sort of aspect of that inclusive culture, a cultural feature that might be considered inclusive, so that you feel you belong and you're free to ask, be great if you gave me recognition in this way. That's really helpful to me. Notice when, because then I'd like to know what I'm doing well, um, so that I can build off of that, having that
Yeah,
more open conversation.
and the flip to that is also, how would you like feedback? Maybe in the constructive way. I think that's also important, to have that dialogue, and to be able to have that conversation, which does rely on, certainly having a level of trust and communication. And these are things I would consider sort of foundational elements to all of this idea of culture. But, the one thing I actually didn't touch on, and I should push, I guess, to make this clear, is we're talking about company culture, or we're talking about workplace culture. It's an entire organization's sort of push towards this, and I don't want to discredit any group. I think it's really important that we recognize that culture can and does typically start at that top, at the senior leadership level, and that might be a policy. So I don't want it to come off on anti-policy. I think that's really important, that those foundational items be set. So, you have to have your senior leaders set that standard, but the key to that is that they've got to be sort of a level of transparency and consistency in the application of it. You can't just have it written. You have to actually, sort of echo what's been or walk the walk again. The next part I think you've touched on, which is having supportive managers and supervisors so that they're able to have these conversations and they're, sort of shown what's required. And the last part is worker participation. All of this doesn't work if workers are not engaged and are not willing to sort of come to the table and share their, what does work or what doesn't work. How do you want to have feedback, or how would you like to receive praise? They need to be involved in this process. And similar to physical safety, if you don't have that worker participation, the workers who are actually doing the work and really, producing that product at the end of the day, you've got a huge gap. So I think those three key components or three areas are fundamental when we start talking about culture and setting culture or even changing culture. Um, yeah, that just as we were talking, I'm like, oh, I never actually addressed the big three here.
Yeah, leadership, leadership is, that commitment of leadership because if it's happens organically, that is great. If it's a positive workplace culture that has evolved and it's organic. However, culture is very dynamic and organizations are dynamic. And, people change and leave and come into an organization. And, in previous years, there was a lot of conversation around culture fit, from a hiring and recruitment perspective. And fortunately, I think we've expanded that to now it's about culture contributors that coming in and contributing to the culture and the organizations that are, embedding some of these psychologically healthy and safe workplace practices are organizations that are evolving, wanting to become more agile and want to become embracing change and know that what was created for certain circumstances maybe needs to be reviewed with a different for a different set of circumstances. So those culture contributors versus culture fit. Though there is still some conversations around culture fit. I still have conversations and trying to the good piece of that is the openness of managers to be able to talk about that and better understand how culture fit. What is the implication for culture fit? What is the benefit of it, and what is some of the risk associated with it in terms of, if you're holding too tightly to what culture fit looks like, that there might be some psychosocial risk involved in that. Maybe you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah, you're this idea of square peg round hole sort of situation, if you will, where you have this defined sort of checklist of attributes you're looking for to sort of fit what you believe is the culture. And then that's the other thing though, is culture fit is interesting because it does imply that there's a significantly ingrained culture that's been well established and everybody's aware of it. And I would challenge those that is that the case? Is it actually such a strong established culture? Because one of the things that I've learned over the years is that you can have this wonderfully robust and well-known organizational culture, if you will, or company culture, sorry. And then you start at this company and you're in a different team or a different department, and you'll find that the department that you're within or the team that you're within has their own culture, sort of subculture, if you will, that's been, and it may not necessarily align perfectly with the overall company culture. And I think that's where I find it interesting when you start talking about culture fit, because is it culture fit for the team or that department, or is it now culture fit for the organization? Because if there's a disconnect, then what you're going to get may not actually be what you think you're getting. Um, and that's why I love the comment about culture influencers, or I've also had a bit of a discussion around in the individual contributors to culture. And there's great positives to that. There's also some drawbacks. If a team culture is really, you know, dependent on this culture enabler or influencer, um, which could be setting a great team environment and department environment, whatever it might be, as soon as that individual transitions into something else, is because in theory, the culture is more or greater than an individual. So to sort of get back to your original point, though, I think when we start talking about culture fit, you have to really look at what is the culture fit we're looking for? Is it the organizational one that's well defined and is actually aligned throughout the organization, or is it potentially a department or team one that may be a little bit different, that may have changed because it is dynamic, and expectations are different. So yeah, that's kind of the bit that I always think about when we talk about culture fits and being super rigid or super stuck, sorry, to that one archetype, if you will.
If you were to describe a culture by attributes or characteristics that would be psychologically healthy and safe, to there's all kinds of choices in that. But how would you? What are some of the attributes that you think that that match up also with the way organizations are looking at some of the things that they're looking for to build? What are some of those features or attributes that you think really support that psychologically healthy and safe workplace?
So from my perspective, I have my big three. There's a little bit of bias in this, but I think trust and transparency are going to be such a key aspect of building that psychologically safe culture. I think there has to be an ability to have communication, to have dialogue, and that implies also the ability to listen, which it ties into that concept of sort of psychological safety to sort of drive creativity. And then the third one, from my perspective, is about support and empathy. I think if you have those sorts of, I call them foundational elements in your team or your company culture, you are setting your organization or your department up for success. And those that are working there, the opportunity to stay and to grow. When they feel like they can reach out to their direct manager or supervisor, when they feel like their peers or coworkers at that level, same level, can listen to them, or can support them, and certainly when they feel that they have a strong trust that senior leadership is being transparent in what their expectations are, um, that they're consistent. I think that those elements or building blocks are setting organizations up for long-term success in creating what we're calling, and based on the CSA standard, a psychologically healthy and safe workplace.
How would how do you make knowing that and those three characteristics or attributes? How could you make that concrete for someone? Like if you were giving advice to a manager to, or, that the organization has identified those three attributes. They align with the values. They align with, they're a good fit for the kind of workplace that they're looking for. How would a organization at the organizational level help infuse those across an organization?
Perfect question. Don't have a silver bullet answer, but I think what I would stress to these organizations is, first you need to recognize that it's going to be a continual process. Like there's not going to be one thing that you're going to be able to implement and it's going to, create all of those things. It's going to establish trust and transparency. It's going to enhance your communication and listening. It's going to provide support and empathy. There's not something specifically that you'll be able to do that'll do all of those things. It's going to be a process. It's also got to be everyone's responsibility. So when I started talking about those three levels, I think one of the things when you start talking about these three or any elements that you want to put in to build a company culture, you need to recognize that it's going to take senior leadership buy-in. It's going to require that your managers and supervisors are consistently sort of approaching and applying the items that you're talking about, and it's going to have to include workers engaged and participating in this process. So how do you do all of those things? I know, and I come from a background in learning and development as well, where we like to say training solves everything. And I do think training has an element to it. I think training is important, but it's going to be tailored training to each of those levels because they each have different roles and responsibilities. I think as an organization and from a senior level, one of the things that employers and certainly workers are looking for is just recognition that it's a clear priority, that the work that's going to go into this, the time that you're going to put into this has value and is supported. Because when you can get into the nuts and bolts and the return on investment and the cost benefit analysis, sometimes those numbers don't necessarily have a direct correlation when we start talking about psychosocial risk factors. It's not as easy as looking at from a safety perspective, your lost time incident frequency or lost time incident severity, where it's tied to your compensation costs, and those things are pretty easy to extrapolate numbers from. These are a little bit more difficult. The other thing that I would prescribe is, open communication. Again, all of those three things that we're talking about across all those levels requires a level of communication and being able to have those conversations. And lastly, if I could just really, again, this is hit on something, is the importance of healthy and positive relationships at the workplace. We spend a third of our lives there. And in that sense, if I give a practical example of what employers could do, one example is that we started actually is called a walk and talk program. And so that was an opportunity for staff this typically happened during COVID though, to get together, be it online or in person at safe distance, and have those sort of conversations to enhance those personal relationships, similar to what I just said earlier about starting the meeting or building in some time for that. So how do you make that concrete? It's a continual process. It's one where I think you need to recognize the value, and that could be in developing relationships, that could be in providing training, even though it's not going to fix everything. It's an important aspect to it, and being consistent. Recognizing it's a priority, and not just it's the priority for the flavor of the month, but it's the priority consistently moving forward. I know when health and safety was first starting to get some traction, we had this sort of expectation that it would be on the manager's monthly agenda as a talking item. Health and safety had to appear every month, regardless of what it was. And that's the kind of priority and consistency I'm talking about when making sure it's not just a mental health awareness month, but it's every month we're having some level of discussion around these key topics.
What I'm hearing from you is that it takes time. And we
In
do
a very
have,
long-winded way, yes.
oh no. And it's not easily measurable. Like it's like, so, that, which is a struggle for, that conversation sometimes with, you had recommended that you need to know what is your current state. So do you have information or a cultural assessment, or do you do some kind of employee survey, or to figure out what is the state of things along some of the attributes that you care about, that you're hopeful or you're working towards, and you have strategic effort toward creating, because it does need to be intentional. Um, it will be created otherwise, for sure. And if you want to achieve, those kind of positive outcomes and have positive workplace culture, which, can sometimes get a bad rap, having a positive workplace culture, not because that's not a positive thing to aspire to. It's that, taken that as it extreme, I guess, that, what does that, the word positive, I think sometimes gets a bad rap. But it's the absence of harms, or mitigating and, ensuring that there isn't harm, which is psychologically healthy and safe. And a positive workplace culture are really, you can use them a tiny bit. I never try to use terms interchangeably because I do think that they need their own space so that you can be accurate in your the actions you take. But if you have a positive workplace culture, you typically would have a psychologically healthy and safe workplace, because you have effort, behavior, expectations, accountability, as you shared, and real conversations when it's not going like that, or taking the time to slow down, and figure it out. And we don't always, in Canadian workplaces or US workplaces, take the time for that planning component piece, that, or to slow down and work on that and do it in a sort of in that thoughtful way, with connecting all those dots between values, the behavior we have, our policies, the systems we have that support it, and figuring out how each one works together. But it is a system level piece of work, as you mentioned. What are some of the obstacles and barriers to having that positive workplace culture?
I think you actually touched on a few of them in the summary. There is one that there's not a cut and dry or direct correlation all the time to value, to costs. Um, and that can be a challenge for organizations. Sometimes it seems so big and so daunting that employers just don't know where to start, frankly. It's still relatively new in the workplace setting. So, what I would encourage those listening to do is, if you're listening to this podcast, obviously you're aware of the discussions ongoing, but there's a lot of great resources out there, both locally and internationally. This concept, like the CSA standard you referenced, has been around now came out in 2013, so over 10 years, meaning there's a lot of supportive documentation and employers that do have case study examples of what they've done. So I do think that in some cases it's not a lack of wanting, it's just a lack of not knowing where to start. And so I think there's some opportunity there as we sort of move forward and continue to gain some more insights. I expect to see more studies published too of some of the benefits. I think there's going to come out in the near future, I hope.
You had mentioned, I'll just circle back to this about the social connection, about because the culture, the interpersonal relationships and whether it's, you know, across business units doing work collaboratively, all of those kinds of things are enabled by the culture, and they're enabled by behavior and sort of all of those kinds of things. But the workplace culture has an influence on it, on how it goes, what it looks like, the shape it takes, and how it can be an amazing growth opportunity for employees, and also how it can sometimes be challenging um, when there's sort of that other. Sometimes it's like there's another character in the room, in the play that's in the room, that is, you know, um, having an influence on how great this could be to collaborate with others, because there's nothing better than working with people to solve a problem or do a piece of work. Humans are built for work, like, whatever kind of work it is, because and we love it individually when we're doing it because we can get in flow when we're doing something we're really passionate about, or even when we're solving a difficult problem. And it also is wonderful to work with others, like-minded people, to get into that flow and make a difference. Um,
What we call those communities of practice, where
yes,
you
communities of
take
practice, like,
individuals
don't
that
do it alone.
are for sure, and not people that would necessarily interact, but they are working towards that goal, and that goal, if you will, to me is that culture. And it's when an organization has the same mindset and the same sort of focus, regardless of where you are within the company. And I think of the famous example from NASA, where they're going on a tour and they ask the janitor, what are we trying to do here, or what is it that you do? And he looks at the person asking and says, we're sending a man to the moon. We're sending someone to space. Like didn't matter position, from top to bottom of the organization, that this same sort of goal. And when I think about that unified acknowledgement or unified push or goal, I think about the culture, like what a culture that must have been to have been established, that we're all in it together, that we're all moving forward, that yeah. So
And that every
that's what kind
job
of jumped to mind.
is like, every job is a part of this. And it'd be wonderful when the sort of the idea of hierarchy is softened, because it's the roles that are important, because each of those roles is so vital to the overall piece of work we're doing. Everyone has a role, whether it's, we've created hierarchies to help and support that from a functional perspective. And I think it's the notion that two things can be true at the same time, that it can be helpful, and it also, we can operate so that the recognition that every role is vital. Yeah, we definitely saw that from a workplace culture during COVID, didn't we? Where, the any person who was in maintenance and cleaning every, you know, store across Canada at night, so for the next morning, so that it would be clean, and we were in COVID, and like that is like the most essential role. And you know, what are they doing? They're making people well. That's what they're doing, in that job. And that's, I guess, the ultimate for leaders to remember that you can also test it with your employees. Like you can, we'd hope that, you and I would hope that we would do like a cultural assessment or take it in and have enough data so that you can make some good decisions from it. And you can also do that anecdotally. You can gather some information and apply it and then make decisions. It always doesn't have to be the total, you don't have to boil the ocean. I know I say that maybe too much, but it's true. You can take one thing and you can say, okay, well, I'm going to find out more about this. And that's also an incredibly positive expression of leadership trust, to ask those questions and then be okay with the answer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm a big qualitative research guy myself. So, you have wonderful sources of information within your organization. Like, who better to know those pain points or that culture or those attributes that are both positive and negative in your organization than the workers, um, than the supervisors and the managers. So, utilize those that are available to help give you that insights to help shape the decisions moving forward and, get that engagement going for sure.
Yeah, and just ask the questions and gather the information, and then you can put it through the psychological health and safety lens, and also the whatever attributes you are wanting to recreate some of the structure and the systems, and then support some of the which you and I love, the training. So the training and the support and building some skills around that, because it's, if it doesn't come a second nature to you to do certain things like recognition, if it's, you can use curiosity and actually use it as a habit, and that will come over time. So there's all kinds of kind of hacks to what I call, like, you can have a hack to emotional intelligence if you needed it. Yeah, which is, like, I'm going to say thank you 5 times. It's like, like, so that to show respect. It's like sometimes we have to make it that simple and clear, and it does sound a little bit funny, but it's like, today, I'm going to have to check that I've said it 3 times so far. I better go, but it does help our brain notice. Then we can train our brain to notice the good, because our brain naturally notices the risk and the bad. So sometimes it does take more effort to train us to observe the good. And then that is one of the, a foundational piece of a psychologically healthy and safe workplace, which is the recognition that you mentioned about, nurturing that piece and just starting with that, recognizing the value that everyone's bringing to that work, as you share as well. You had mentioned about the social connections. This is kind of a precursor to what's coming. So I have another podcast, which is the Conference Board of Canada had just completed their Canada-wide study on social connection at work. And I'm going to be chatting with Dr. Lee Ringwald in January or February around that. So there will be some more information for workplaces on that social connection, and you can also offer advice on that too, because it's one thing that doesn't get a lot of. I think it gets confused in the culture conversation a little bit, where we think of social connection as it's sort of maybe perhaps a misunderstanding of the social word in it, which is really not about, the social lives of people or the social functions. It's around that people coming together, knowing more about each other so that they can work well together, and then do really meaningful and good work. That's kind of that's the word social is the interaction of people together and having that relational field really well, well built and on that foundation of trust, communication, and support and empathy. That's a great three leg stool for leaders to think about. Stephen, thank you for that. Do you have any advice for managers or leaders who are wanting to take in 2025, wanting to look at their culture and notice more about it and observe and figure out what might be needed?
Yeah, go to the source. I think it's important to engage your workforce, be it informally or formal process. I do think there's value in finding out, what is the understanding organizationally from the top to the bottom and making sure that there's alignment there. Because if there's not alignment there, it sort of highlights what your next sort of step should be, is to create that alignment and make sure that there's this unified understanding, so that you're all singing from the same song sheet, and then you can move forward and start picking off. I'm a big fan of the CSA standards 13 psychosocial risk factors, and I think that organizations should look at them potentially even individually. I know we talked about the interconnection between organizational culture and civility and respect and growth and development, and I think there's a lot of interconnection between them. But when I say look at them individually, what I mean by that is you can look at them as pieces to the puzzle, and you don't have to do the entire puzzle at once. I think it's important to recognize that could be a lot and maybe too much to try to take on at once. But if, for example, when you do your sort of gap analysis of your organization, you're seeing, one or two things that really stand out, look to see if there's a factor that aligns with that, and maybe that's the first one you want to tackle. That would be my suggestion, is to make it into bite-sized pieces and just recognize that it's going to be a continual improvement process. The plan, do, check, act is popular for a reason.
Yes. And it is adopting, looking at your culture and looking at psychological health and safety. It's the way, eventually, in the same way that we think of health and safety. It's a part of the business. So starting to think about it that way, so that it gets around that barrier of that this is more work. It's just different work, doing it differently, and then letting go of what ways of working that probably aren't advancing both the company or that goal of a psychologically healthy and safe workplace, and a positive workplace culture. So thank you for that. I appreciate your time. If people want to reach out and connect with you and find out more about some of the things you've shared today, how would they do that?
I am on LinkedIn. Really easy to find. I'm somewhat active on there. I think that'd be the easiest route to get to me, for sure.
Okay, great. Thank you for all your time, and thank you for anyone who's tuned in to listen or watch on YouTube. And thanks to Flourish DX for who is the sponsor for the podcast and enabling us to bring conversations and ideas of workplace improvement around psychological health and safety that can influence mental health. And I'm Kim MacDonald. You can always reach out to me on LinkedIn or at my website, 13 Factors, and via email. And always want to invite people to come and chat with me and offer me names of guests and topics that we can go forward with on the podcast. Always open to that. So please do reach out, and thanks again.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychealthandsafety.com.